Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of the Ozark Mountains. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know in which places and at what times of day or night these documented stories reach. The Ozark Mountains, 1905. A sprawling timber estate nestled in the hills of Missouri, far from prying eyes and whispers. Thornfield Manor stood as a monument to the timber fortune of Augustus Thornfield, its gables and turrets rising above ancient oaks like accusing fingers. The day of his funeral brought storms, as if the mountains themselves mourned. But what followed the reading of his will would echo through the valleys for decades to come. According to county records, 23 people attended Augustus Thornfield's funeral. 23 people watched his mahogany casket lower into the sodden earth of the family cemetery. 23 people signed the mourner's book. Yet when questioned later, each would give slightly different accounts of who was present that day, and none could clearly recall seeing Hazel Thornfield, the daughter, the heiress, the woman who would, within hours, lock herself in the mansion's attic and remain there for the next 37 years. The Thornfield estate's importance to Shannon County cannot be overstated. Tax records from 1902 show the family owned over 12,000 acres of prime timberland stretching from the current river to the edge of what is now the Mark Twain National Forest. Augustus had built an empire from nothing, arriving from Boston in 1868 with nothing but ambition and a small inheritance. By the time of his death, the Thornfield Lumber Company employed nearly 200 men and supplied lumber to 3 states. What makes this case particularly unusual is not just Hazel's self-imposed isolation, but the meticulous documentation surrounding it. The Thornfield estate generated hundreds of pages of legal documents, correspondence, and local newspaper accounts. Yet despite this wealth of information, the true nature of what happened after the will reading remains elusive. The facts, as they're known, paint a picture both incomplete and disturbing. Hazel Thornfield was 32 years old when her father died. A spinster by the standards of the time, though surviving photographs show a woman of striking appearance, tall, with dark hair, often arranged in an austere style that emphasized her pale complexion and intense gaze. She had been educated in St. Louis and briefly in New York, unusual for a woman from the rural Ozarks. According to accounts from the household staff, she returned from her studies in 1894 a changed woman, more withdrawn, more serious. The local physician, Dr. Samuel Woodward, noted in his private journal that Miss Thornfield's episodes of melancholy have increased in frequency since her return from the East. What these episodes entailed is never specified. The Thornfield family's origins were somewhat mysterious, even to locals. Augustus had arrived in the Ozarks shortly after the Civil War, presenting himself as a businessman from Boston with connections to Eastern banking interests. Public records confirm his purchase of initial timber rights in 1869, but little exists to document his life before arriving in Missouri. A marriage certificate from 1872 records his union with Elizabeth Caldwell, daughter of a prominent St. Louis merchant. Hazel was born the following year, and Elizabeth died in childbirth. Augustus never remarried. Those who knew him described Augustus as methodical, ambitious, and intensely private. The manager of the Bank of Eminence wrote in a letter to his brother in 1887 that Thornfield conducts his affairs with a precision that borders on obsession. Every decision calculated, every risk measured. He speaks little of personal matters, but will discourse at length on timber yields and market projections. The one exception is his daughter, for whom he appears to harbor ambitions far beyond our modest region. These ambitions manifested in Hazel's education. While most young women in the area received limited schooling, if any, Hazel was first taught by a series of governesses imported from St. Louis and later sent to Marian College for Women. In 1892, at the age of 19, she traveled to New York to attend a women's program affiliated with Columbia University. a nearly unheard-of opportunity for a young woman from rural Missouri. Letters between Hazel and her father during this period, preserved in the Shannon County Historical Society archives, reveal a bright, curious mind engaging with new ideas. She wrote of attending lectures on economics, reading extensively on business management, and observing financial markets. In one particularly revealing passage from 1893, she noted, "Father, I begin to understand what you have built and why. The mechanisms of capital are not so different from your lumber mill, raw material transformed through strategic application of pressure and precision. I find I have an aptitude for such calculations." Augustus's replies were invariably encouraging. "Continue your studies with vigor," he wrote in February 1893. "What I have built is merely the foundation. What you shall build upon it will be the true Thornfield legacy." What happened in New York to change the trajectory of Hazel's life remains one of the central mysteries of this case. The historical record provides only fragments. A withdrawal from her program in early 1894, documented in university administrative records, but without explanation. A hotel bill from the Murray Hill Hotel, showing an extended stay of 3 weeks beyond her expected departure date. A telegram from Augustus to his business partner in eminence, returning with Hazel. "Prepare the East Wing. Discretion essential." When Hazel returned to Thornfield Manor in the spring of 1894, local observers noted the change immediately. Mrs. Catherine Wilson, wife of the Episcopal minister, wrote in her personal diary, "Called at Thornfield today to welcome Miss Hazel home. Found her much altered, the vivacity and warmth of her manner entirely subdued. She received me politely but distantly, as one might receive a stranger rather than the woman who has known her since infancy. When I inquired after her studies, she replied only that New York proved educational in unexpected ways." Mr. Thornfield redirected the conversation to church matters with unusual haste. For the next 11 years, Hazel rarely left the estate. She declined invitations to social events in eminence. She attended church irregularly and always sat apart from other congregants. When business associates visited Thornfield Manor, she would appear briefly for dinner before excusing herself. The only consistent contact she maintained was with her father's attorney, Jonathan Creed, with whom she conducted a regular correspondence regarding financial and legal matters. Dr. Woodward's records indicate he was called to the manor approximately twice yearly to attend to what were described as Hazel's nervous conditions. His notes, while circumspect in accordance with medical confidentiality, mentioned symptoms consistent with what modern medicine might identify as anxiety or depression, difficulty sleeping, loss of appetite, periods of intense agitation. In a confidential letter to a medical colleague in St. Louis, Woodward wrote, "The case presents as one of severe emotional trauma, origin undisclosed. Patient refuses to discuss precipitating events and responds unfavorably to any suggestion of treatment beyond mild sedatives. Father, equally reticent." Augustus Thornfield's decline began in the winter of 1904. Initially diagnosed as influenza, his illness progressed to pneumonia and eventually heart failure. By spring 1905, he was confined to his bed. According to household accounts, Hazel took charge of both his care and the family business during this period, demonstrating unexpected competence in both spheres. Mrs. Whitley's daily logs record that Miss Thornfield now manages the household with precision. She reviews account books after breakfast, corresponds with the lumber office until luncheon, then sits with her father until dinner. In the evening, she often works late into the night at Mr. Rourke Thornfield's desk, reviewing documents by lamplight. Frederick Harmon, Augustus's business partner, expressed surprise at Hazel's sudden engagement with the timber business. In a letter to a lumber broker in St. Louis, dated April 1905, he wrote, "Miss Thornfield has taken an unexpectedly active interest in company affairs. She questions our harvesting schedules, challenges our pricing strategies, and has proposed a significant reorganization of our distribution channels. Most remarkable is her grasp of financial matters. She speaks of bonds, futures, and market trends with a fluency I would not have anticipated. A says nothing of this transformation, but seems pleased by it. Augustus Thornfield died on June 12, 1905. The funeral was held 2 days later at the family cemetery on the estate grounds. Reverend Wilson of the Episcopal Church officiated. The sermon, reprinted in the Eminence Courier, praised Augustus as a man of vision who transformed wilderness into prosperity, and made no mention of Hazel beyond noting her status as the surviving heir. The day of the will reading dawned clear after the previous day's storm. Family members, business associates, and the family attorney, Mr. Jonathan Creed from Springfield, gathered in the Manor's library at precisely 10 o'clock. The heavy drapes were drawn back, allowing light to stream across the oriental carpet and illuminate the dust motes dancing in the still air. Mr. Creed, according to his own account written some years later, arrived with the document in a leather portfolio, its seal unbroken since Augustus had signed it 3 months prior. There was a tension in the room unlike anything I'd previously witnessed in my 27 years of legal practice, Creed wrote in 1927, shortly before his own death. Miss Thornfield sat apart from the others, near the window, her face composed, but her hands repeatedly smoothing the fabric of her black mourning dress. The will itself seemed straightforward at first. Various bequests to distant relatives, provisions for long-serving staff, a substantial donation to the Episcopal Church in nearby Eminence. But then came the section pertaining to the bulk of the estate. According to Creed's notes, Augustus had made an unusual stipulation. Hazel would inherit everything, the house, the business, the land, but only if she married within 1 year of his death. If she remained unmarried, a cousin from the Boston branch of the family would take control of the timber business, while Hazel would retain only the house and a modest allowance. What happened next is described differently by various witnesses. Mrs. Eleanor Whitley, the housekeeper, later told the Eminence Courier that Miss Hazel stood up so suddenly her chair fell backward. She made no sound, but her face, I'll never forget how the blood drained away until she looked like one of those marble statues in the garden. Another account, from Augustus's business partner, Frederick Harmon, claims Hazel laughed, a sound so unnatural it chilled the room despite the summer heat. All accounts agree on what followed. Without speaking, Hazel left the library. Those present heard her footsteps on the grand staircase, then across the upper floor, followed by the distinct sound of the attic door opening and closing. When she did not reappear for luncheon, Mrs. Whitley went to check on her. She found the attic door locked from the inside. "Miss Thornfield," the housekeeper called, "are you quite well?" According to Mrs. Whitley's statement to Dr. Woodward, Hazel's reply was calm and measured. "I am perfectly well, Mrs. Whitley. I require nothing at present except privacy. Please inform Mr. Creed that I accept my father's terms and will consider suitable arrangements in due course." By evening, concern had grown among the household. Dr. Woodward was summoned from town. His attempts to speak with Hazel through the door were met with increasingly terse responses. Finally, she announced that she would communicate only in writing and would accept meals left outside the attic door 3 times daily. A note slid under the door instructed Mrs. Whitley to place her personal effects in a trunk and leave it by the door that evening. And so began what the local newspaper would later dub the vigil of the Thornfield heiress. Days passed, then weeks. Household staff reported hearing movement in the attic, footsteps pacing in the night, the occasional sound of furniture being moved. 3 times daily, trays of food were left at the door. The empty trays would later be found placed neatly outside, the food largely untouched. Sometimes notes would accompany them, brief practical communications regarding household matters. Hazel continued to manage the estate's affairs through written correspondence. Signing documents slid under her door. Meanwhile, speculation ran rampant throughout Shannon County. Some suggested Hazel had been disfigured by grief. Others whispered of mental instability running in the Thornfield blood. Augustus's own mother had reportedly suffered from nervous exhaustion that kept her bedridden for the last decade of her life. The most persistent rumors, however, centered on the will itself. Why would Augustus, who by all accounts doted on his only daughter, impose such a condition? Frederick Harmon, in a letter to his sister in Kansas City, dated September 1905, wrote, "The situation at Thornfield grows more peculiar by the day. Miss T. conducts business matters with remarkable clarity through her written directives, yet refuses all visitors and remains sequestered in the upper rooms." One cannot help but wonder what A knew that would prompt such unusual terms. There were whispers, you know, about her time in New York, though nothing was ever substantiated. What these whispers entailed, Harmon never specified. The attic of Thornfield Manor had never been designed as living quarters. Originally used for storage of household items and seasonal decorations, it spanned the entire top floor of the central portion of the house, approximately 30 feet by 40 feet, with dormer windows on all four sides and a ceiling that peaked at 15 feet in the center. Access was via a narrow staircase behind a door on the third-floor landing. According to household inventories conducted after Augustus's death, the attic contained numerous trunks of family possessions, furniture not currently in use, and boxes of business records dating to the founding of the lumber company. It also housed a small water closet installed in 1897 during renovations to the main house, a convenience that would prove crucial to Hazel's long seclusion. How Hazel transformed this space into a habitable apartment remains a subject of speculation. Delivery records from various merchants in eminence show orders placed by Mrs. Whitley in the months following the will reading. Carpeting, draperies, a cast-iron stove, bookshelves, and a writing desk. Receipts for these items bear Hazel's signature, confirming her authorization of the purchases. A carpenter from Van Buren was commissioned to install shelving and make unspecified modifications to the attic space, though he was reportedly blindfolded while being led up the stairs and allowed to work only when Hazel retreated behind a makeshift screen. As the one-year deadline approached, a parade of potential suitors began to arrive at Thornfield Manor. Young men from prominent Missouri families, business associates seeking to consolidate timber interests, even a distant cousin from the Philadelphia Thornfields. None were granted an audience with Hazel. Each received a politely worded letter declining their interest. Each letter slid under the attic door to be delivered by Mrs. Whitley. The most persistent of these suitors was James Holloway, son of a St. Louis banking family and an acquaintance from Hazel's college days. Holloway arrived at Thornfield Manor in April 1906, 2 months before the deadline, and refused to leave without speaking to Hazel directly. According to Mrs. Whitley's account, he camped on the veranda for 3 days, sending notes up to the attic that received no response. On the 4th day, a letter finally emerged from under the attic door. "Mr. Holloway, your persistence does you credit, but cannot alter my decision. What you propose, a marriage of convenience that would secure my inheritance while allowing me to maintain my independence, might seem a reasonable compromise to a rational mind. However, my father's stipulation was designed precisely to force such a compromise, and in so doing to place me once again under the authority of another. This I cannot accept, even from one as well-intentioned as yourself. Please return to St. Louis with my best wishes for your future endeavors. H." Thornfield Holloway departed the following morning. In later years, he would become a prominent banker and philanthropist in St. Louis. His private papers, donated to the Missouri Historical Society after his death in 1951, include a brief memoir that mentions the Thornfield incident. I never understood why Hazel refused what seemed a mutually beneficial arrangement. We had been friendly during her time in the East, sharing similar interests in finance and literature. I had no desire to control her life or her inheritance, quite the contrary. I admired her independence of mind and would have been content with a marriage that existed primarily on paper. It was only years later, when I heard rumors of what had occurred during her final months in New York, that I began to comprehend the depth of her distrust. By then, of course, it was far too late. The deadline passed. According to the terms of the will, control of the Thornfield Lumber Company transferred to cousin Edgar Thornfield of Boston. Yet when Edgar arrived to claim his inheritance, he found the business in disarray. Account books showed unexplained withdrawals. Timber contracts had been mysteriously canceled. Key employees had resigned without explanation. Within 3 months, Edgar sold his interest in the company at a considerable loss and returned east, reportedly remarking that the Ozarks can keep their cursed trees and their cursed family. Edgar's brief tenure in eminence did yield one significant piece of information. In a letter to his wife, discovered among family papers in Boston in 1965, he wrote, "I confronted that attorney, Creed, about the deplorable state of the company affairs. After much prevarication, he admitted that Hazel had been systematically dismantling the business for months before Augustus's death, converting assets to cash and investing them elsewhere. The old man must have known, how could he not? Yet he allowed it to proceed." Creed claims ignorance of her motives, but let slip a curious remark. He said, "Miss Thornfield learned certain lessons in New York that her father failed to protect her from. This is merely the application of those lessons." When pressed, he would say no more. Hazel, meanwhile, remained in the attic. The modest allowance stipulated in the will proved sufficient to maintain the house and a skeleton staff. Years passed. Mrs. Whitley continued her dutiful delivery of meals and collection of written instructions. Occasionally, packages would arrive from St. Louis or even New York, books primarily, according to the delivery records. Sometimes sheet music, though no one ever heard a piano playing in the attic. In 1908, Dr. Woodward made one final attempt to coax Hazel out, or at least examine her. His journal records the exchange. "I called through the door that her continued isolation could not be beneficial to her health, that fresh air and sunlight were necessary, that I feared for her mind as well as her body. 'There is nothing wrong with my mind, doctor,' came the reply after a long pause, 'and my body serves its purpose adequately. Please do not concern yourself further.' When he suggested that he might need to involve authorities out of concern for her welfare, a note was slid under the door. Its contents, preserved in the County Historical Society archives, read simply, 'I am a free woman of sound mind choosing to live as I wish on my own property. Any attempt to remove me will be met with legal consequences you cannot afford.' Dr. Woodward did not return to Thornfield Manor. By 1910, Hazel's self-imposed confinement had become something of a local legend. Children dared each other to approach the manor and look up at the attic windows, hoping to catch a glimpse of the reclusive heiress. Occasionally, someone would report seeing a shadow moving behind the curtains or a pale face gazing out at the mountains. These sightings were never confirmed. The most substantial documentation from this period comes from Mrs. Whitley's personal diary, discovered after her death in 1926. The housekeeper maintained meticulous records of her interactions, or lack thereof, with her employer. Most entries are mundane. Left breakfast tray, returned for it at 10:30, tea untouched, toast and eggs consumed, no correspondence today. But occasionally there are entries that hint at something more. April 17, 1912, informed Miss Thornfield of the Titanic disaster as per the newspaper accounts. Received no response but heard what sounded like crying from behind the door late into the evening. December 25, 1915, left the usual Christmas dinner tray with an additional slice of plum pudding. Found a small wrapped package with my name on it when I returned for the tray. Inside was a cameo brooch I recognize as having belonged to the elder Mrs. Thornfield. No note accompanied it. June 4, 1917, unusual sounds from the attic today, like furniture being dragged across the floor for several hours. Later, what sounded like glass breaking. When I inquired if assistance was needed, received a note saying, "All is well. Some rearrangement was necessary." November 11, 1918, brought news of the armistice. Miss Thornfield's note in response read only, "War's end. Other conflicts endure." Most peculiar. As World War I engulfed Europe and then drew in America, life in the isolated corners of the Ozarks continued largely unchanged. Tax records show Thornfield Manor's property taxes were paid promptly each year. Census takers in 1910 and 1920 noted Hazel Thornfield as the property's owner, though no direct contact was made. The few remaining staff gradually departed, first the groundskeeper in 1918, then the cook in 1921, leaving only Mrs. Whitley to maintain the increasingly dilapidated manor. In 1923, a fire in the Eminence Courthouse destroyed many local records, including whatever documentation might have existed about the Thornfield family prior to their arrival in Missouri. This loss further obscured the already mysterious history of Hazel and her father. What remained were fragments, business ledgers, personal correspondence preserved by recipients, newspaper accounts, and oral histories passed down by locals. One such account comes from Thomas Winslow, who worked as a delivery boy for the general store in Eminence from 1920 to 1925. In an interview conducted for the Shannon County Historical Society in 1967, Winslow recalled his monthly deliveries to Thornfield Manor. Mrs. Whitley would meet me at the service entrance, never the main door. Paul was very particular about the order, specific brands of tea, certain types of paper and ink, unusual canned goods you wouldn't expect an old lady to want. Once a month, I'd bring packages that came by post from places like Chicago or New York. Heavy things, usually. Books, I figured. Sometimes I'd ask Mrs. Whitley about Miss Thornfield, just being friendly. She'd just purse her lips and say, "Miss Thornfield values her privacy, young man." But one time, must have been the summer of '24, I was loading the empty crates back on my wagon when I looked up at the house. There was a woman watching from the attic window. Not just a shadow, mind you, but clear as day. Thin face, hair pulled back severe-like. She was holding what looked like a large book, or ledger. When she saw me looking, she stepped back from the window. I mentioned it to Mrs. Whitley the next time, and she just said, "You have an active imagination, Mr. Winslow," but she looked worried. Another perspective comes from Eliza Johnson, who briefly worked as a housemaid at Thornfield Manor in 1920 before leaving to marry. Her account, recorded by her granddaughter in a family history compiled in 1978, describes the atmosphere of the house during this period. That place wasn't right. Not haunted, mind you, nothing so dramatic. Just wrong somehow. Like a clock that ticks too slow. The rooms downstairs were grand, but fading. Furniture covered in sheets, carpets faded where sun hit through the windows year after year. Mrs. Whitley kept things clean, but couldn't stop time from wearing it all down. And always, there was the knowledge that she was up there listening. You'd be dusting the third-floor landing, and you'd hear the floor creak above your head, following your movements. Once I was singing to myself while polishing the banister, and I swear I heard humming from behind the attic door, the same tune, just a few notes behind me. I gave my notice the next day. The death of Mrs. Eleanor Whitley in November 1926 marked a turning point. According to her obituary in the Eminence Courier, she passed away in her sleep at the age of 78, having served the Thornfield family for over 40 years. The funeral was held at the Episcopal Church in town. Attendance was modest, mostly elderly residents who remembered the Thornfields in their prime. No one from the manor attended. A curious detail emerges from the church records of this period. The Reverend Wilson's successor, Reverend Thomas Grant, made a notation in the parish registry that a substantial donation was received for Mrs. Whitley's funeral arrangements, delivered by messenger with instructions that a portion be used to establish a small maintenance fund for her grave. The balance of the donation was designated for church repairs. No signature accompanied the instructions, but the handwriting matched previous correspondence from Thornfield Manor. The question of who would replace Mrs. Whitley as Hazel's connection to the outside world was answered in an unexpected manner. 3 days after the funeral, attorney Jonathan Creed received a letter bearing the Thornfield seal. The contents, later preserved in his files, were brief and to the point. Mr. Creed, I am aware of Mrs. Whitley's passing. Please arrange for all deliveries to be left at the service entrance on Monday mornings. Payment will be left in the usual locked box. No replacement staff is required. The house and I will manage, as we always have. H. Thornfield Creed, now elderly himself and reportedly troubled by his long association with the Thornfield estate, took the unusual step of traveling to the manor himself. According to his clerk, Marcus Abernathy, the attorney returned from this visit visibly shaken. Mr. Creed would not speak of what transpired at Thornfield, Abernathy later wrote. He merely instructed me to arrange the delivery service as requested and to ensure that property taxes continued to be paid from Miss Thornfield's accounts. When I pressed him for details, he said only, "Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again. Let us hope this one remains locked." During this period, Thornfield Manor began to show significant signs of deterioration. Without regular maintenance, the grounds grew wild. Ivy crawled unchecked up the stone walls. Shutters hung askew. The once elegant fountain in the circular drive became choked with leaves and debris. Only the most essential repairs, a leaking roof, a broken window, were authorized in Hazel's increasingly infrequent written instructions. A survey conducted by the county tax assessor in 1928 described the property as a once grand estate in advanced state of decline. Manor house structurally sound, but showing significant cosmetic deterioration, grounds untended, outbuildings largely collapsed, property value adjusted downward accordingly. Photographs from this assessment, preserved in county records, show a haunting image, a Gothic revival mansion, slowly being reclaimed by the surrounding forest, with a single light visible in an attic dormer window. The Great Depression hit the Ozarks hard. Timber prices collapsed. Farms failed. The population of Shannon County declined as families moved west, seeking work. Through it all, Thornfield Manor stood on its hill, increasingly isolated as neighboring properties were abandoned. Local delivery services continued to leave packages at the service entrance as instructed. Payment was always left in the locked box, exact change and crisp bills that somehow always seemed newer than the currency in local circulation. The most detailed account from this period comes from Dr. C., Woodward's son, also a physician, who took over his father's practice after the elder Woodward's death in 1929. In the spring of 1932, he was summoned to Thornfield Manor by an unusual letter. "Dr. Woodward, I find myself in need of medical consultation. I understand you have assumed your father's practice. While I cannot permit a physical examination, I would appreciate your professional opinion on certain symptoms. Please bring reference materials pertaining to cardiac abnormalities and arrive at precisely 3 p.m. on Thursday next. Instructions will be provided upon arrival. H. Thornfield." According to the younger Dr. Woodward's account given to the Historical Society in 1963, he arrived at the appointed time with his medical bag and several textbooks. The house appeared deserted, its paint peeling, gardens overgrown. A note was pinned to the front door directing him to proceed to the second-floor landing and speak toward the attic door. "I called out as instructed," Dr. Woodward recalled. After a moment, a woman's voice responded, cultured, articulate, but with a raspy quality suggesting disuse. She described symptoms consistent with angina pectoris, chest pain, shortness of breath, pain radiating to the left arm. When I suggested that I needed to listen to her heart and take her blood pressure, she refused. Instead, she asked detailed questions about treatments, prognosis, and management. The conversation lasted nearly an hour. Her knowledge of medical terminology was surprising, better than some of my colleagues, frankly. When I finally asked how long she had been experiencing these symptoms, there was a long pause. Then she said, "Since 1905, since the day of the will reading." Before I could respond, I heard retreating footsteps. A moment later, an envelope slid under the door containing $30, an exorbitant sum for a consultation at that time. I never heard from her again. The doctor's account provides a rare glimpse of Hazel's physical condition after decades of seclusion. Based on the symptoms described and the medical knowledge of the time, modern physicians might diagnose a chronic anxiety disorder accompanied by panic attacks, possibly complicated by the effects of long-term isolation and limited physical activity. The cardiac symptoms, while potentially indicative of actual heart disease, could also represent the somatic manifestation of severe psychological distress, what contemporary medicine might term psychosomatic symptoms. In 1937, a significant development occurred that shed some light on Hazel Thornfield's activities during her decades of seclusion. Jonathan Creed died, and his firm's records were transferred to his successor. Among them was a series of correspondence between Creed and various financial institutions dating back to 1906. These documents revealed that shortly after losing control of the family timber business, Hazel had directed Creed to sell her remaining assets and invest the proceeds in a portfolio of stocks, bonds, and real estate holdings as far away as Chicago and New York. More remarkably, these investments had been managed through written instructions from Hazel that demonstrated an uncanny financial acumen. She had divested from the market entirely in early 1929, months before the crash. She had purchased depressed real estate in St. Louis and Kansas City during the worst years of the Depression. By 1937, despite the economic catastrophe that had ruined so many, Hazel Thornfield's wealth had multiplied several times over. The new attorney, Morris Fleming, wrote to Hazel seeking confirmation of his appointment to manage her affairs. Her response, preserved in the firm's archives, reveals a mind still sharp despite decades of isolation. Mr. Fleming, your credentials are acceptable. Please continue to execute my instructions precisely as Mr. Creed did. Do not, under any circumstances, attempt to visit Thornfield Manor without explicit invitation. The world beyond these walls holds little interest for me, but I remain keenly attentive to my financial interests. Enclosed, you will find instructions for several transactions I wish you to complete before the month's end. H. Thornfield. The instructions that followed included the purchase of war bonds, this being the eve of World War II, and investment in several manufacturing companies that would later become critical to the war effort. Fleming's private notes, discovered among his papers after his death in 1959, express both admiration and unease regarding his unusual client. Miss Thornfield's financial instincts border on the uncanny. She anticipates market shifts weeks or months before they occur, making adjustments to her portfolio that invariably prove advantageous. One might attribute this to luck, were it not for the consistency of her success. More likely, it is the result of her peculiar existence. Isolated from the emotional currents that sway other investors, she analyzes information with cold precision. The newspapers and financial journals delivered to Thornfield Manor each week are apparently put to good use. Yet I cannot help but wonder at the cost of such isolation. What manner of life is it to observe the world only through the printed page and never participate in it directly? What wounds or fears could drive someone to such extremes? And why does Creed's file contain such explicit warnings never to inquire about her time in New York? The war years brought changes to the Ozarks, as they did everywhere. Young men left for military service. Women took jobs previously closed to them. Rationing affected daily life. At Thornfield Manor, the only noticeable change was the frequency of deliveries, which decreased to once monthly due to fuel restrictions. Tax and utility records show that electricity had been connected to the property in 1934, though locals noted that only a single light, in the attic, was ever visible at night. In 1942, a storm damaged part of the manor's roof. According to county records, a repair crew from Eminence was hired, the first people besides delivery personnel to approach the house in years. The foreman, Joseph Miller, later reported that written instructions were left at the service entrance detailing exactly what repairs were needed. The crew was instructed to work only between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m., and under no circumstances to attempt entry to the attic. Payment, in cash and generous, was left in the locked box, as usual. The strangest thing, Miller told the Eminence Courier, was that we could feel we were being watched the whole time. Not just idle curiosity, like you might expect from a recluse, but studying us, assessing. I've been in construction 30 years, and I've never felt so judged by someone I couldn't even see. Miller's account includes one detail not reported in the newspaper. While working on the east gable, I caught a glimpse through the dormer window. The attic wasn't what I expected, not some dusty storage room. What I saw looked like a proper apartment. Bookshelves covering one wall, a desk with papers neatly arranged, what looked like oriental rugs on the floor, and maps. Several large maps hanging on the walls with colored pins stuck in them. Before I could see more, a curtain was drawn across the window from inside. As the war ended and America entered the prosperous post-war period, Thornfield Manor remained frozen in time. The once grand estate had fallen into disrepair around its still occupied attic. Locals now treated the property with a mixture of fear and reverence. Parents warned children to stay away. Hunters avoided the surrounding woods. The legend of the woman who had locked herself away for decades took on an almost mythical quality. In the spring of 1942, Morris Fleming received what would be his final communication from Hazel Thornfield. "Mr. Fleming, I find myself contemplating the end of certain arrangements. Please prepare the necessary documents to transfer ownership of Thornfield Manor and all associated properties to the Shannon County Historical Society upon the event of my passing. My financial holdings are to be liquidated and the proceeds divided as per the enclosed instructions. I anticipate these provisions will be executed sooner rather than later. H. Thornfield." Concerned by the tone of the letter, Fleming did something his predecessor had never dared. He telephoned the manor. To his surprise, the call was answered on the third ring. The voice that spoke was faint, but composed. "Thornfield residence. Miss Thornfield? This is Morris Fleming. I received your letter and—" "Mr. Fleming, you have overstepped. The telephone is for emergencies only, as stated in our initial agreement. Forgive me, but your letter suggested you might be unwell." A long silence followed. Then, "I have been unwell since 1905, Mr. Fleming. The difference is that now I am also dying. Please prepare the documents as requested, and do not contact me again except by written correspondence." The line went dead. Fleming's notes from this period reflect his growing concern. In a memo dated May 23, 1942, he wrote, "Have consulted with Dr. Heiress regarding ethical obligations toward a client who may be in medical distress but refuses intervention. Legal position clear. Miss T. is of sound mind and has explicitly rejected assistance. Moral position less certain. Have arranged for more frequent deliveries to the manor, and included notice that medical supplies can be procured if needed. No response received." True to her word on June 17, 1942, 37 years and 1 day after the reading of her father's will, Hazel Thornfield was found dead in the attic of Thornfield Manor. The discovery was made by a delivery boy who, finding several previous deliveries untouched at the service entrance, alerted the county sheriff. After forcing entry to the attic, they found a scene that defied expectation. The space had been transformed into an elegant apartment, meticulously maintained despite the decay of the house around it. Bookshelves lined the walls filled with volumes on finance, medicine, history, and law. A writing desk held neatly arranged correspondence. French doors had been installed, leading to a small balcony overlooking the Ozark Mountains, a modification not visible from the ground due to the roof's design. Most striking, according to the sheriff's report, was the collection of newspapers. Thousands of them, dating from 1905 to 1942, stacked chronologically and annotated in a precise hand. World events, stock prices, obituaries, all marked and cross-referenced in a system so complex the sheriff described it as the work of either a genius or a madwoman. The report also noted the presence of multiple filing cabinets containing financial records, correspondence copies, and what appeared to be research notes on various topics. One cabinet held nothing but maps. Detailed topographical maps of the Ozarks, street maps of major American cities, and world maps with colored pins marking locations across Europe, Asia, and the Americas. None of the investigating officers could determine the significance of these markings. Hazel herself was found seated in a chair by the window, a ledger open on her lap. The county coroner determined the cause of death to be heart failure. She was 69 years old. The true revelation, however, came in the form of a journal found in the writing desk. Beginning on the day of the will reading and continuing until 3 days before her death, Hazel Thornfield had documented her self-imposed exile in meticulous detail. The journal, now preserved in the Shannon County Historical Society, provides the only first-hand account of her extraordinary seclusion. The first entry, dated June 16, 1905, reads, "Father is buried. His will is read. And now I understand everything. The condition he imposed, marriage within a year, was never meant to secure the family line or ensure the business remained in family hands. It was a test, a challenge, a chance to prove myself worthy of the Thornfield name in a way no mere inheritance could establish. He knew I would rather lose the business than surrender my independence to a husband who would control both it and me. He knew I would choose the attic over the altar, and in that choice he has given me the greatest gift of all, freedom from the world and its expectations. The business is already lost. I arranged its dismantling months ago when I first learned of Father's condition. By the time Cousin Edgar arrives to claim his prize, he will find nothing but empty ledgers and canceled contracts. Meanwhile, my own arrangements proceed exactly as planned. From this room, I will rebuild what Father only imagined. I will create a fortune that makes the timber business look like a child's allowance. And I will do it all without ever having to endure another dinner party, another suitor, another pitying glance from people who see nothing but a spinster past her prime. The door is locked. The journey begins. Subsequent entries detail Hazel's financial strategies, her careful manipulation of her public image, and her growing satisfaction with her isolated existence. She writes of receiving news of world events with detached interest. She documents physical symptoms, including the heart condition that would eventually kill her, with clinical precision, and she repeatedly returns to the events that precipitated her retreat to the attic. The most revealing passage, dated on the 10th anniversary of her seclusion, provides a glimpse into her motivations. 10 years since I ascended these stairs. 10 years of watching the world from above rather than moving awkwardly through it. Father understood what New York taught me, that I am unsuited for the world as it exists, not because of any deficiency in me, but because the world demands performances I cannot give, the grieving daughter, the eligible heiress, the social ornament, the potential wife, each role requiring a kind of submission I find intolerable. Here, I am only myself. My mind is free to work without constraint. My decisions are my own. My daily life proceeds according to rhythms I establish. Even Mrs. Whitley, loyal as she is, remains at a perfect distance, close enough to serve, but not so close as to intrude. I think of Father's library, of the glass case that held the butterfly specimens he collected in his youth. Beautiful creatures pinned and labeled, preserved behind glass for others to admire. That was the fate he saved me from, though few would understand it as such. Instead of being displayed in someone else's case, I have built my own. The difference is essential. Other entries shed light on how Hazel maintained her mental faculties during decades of isolation. She describes a rigorous daily schedule, morning exercises, reading sessions, financial analysis, and correspondence. She kept a series of project journals focusing on different intellectual pursuits: mathematics, botanical classification, architectural design, and, most extensively, economic theory. One entry from 1919 notes, "Completed my analysis of post-war European markets. Without the distractions that plague other investors, social obligations, emotional reactions to headlines, the constant chatter of so-called experts, I see patterns they miss entirely. So distance provides clarity. Isolation sharpens focus. What others might view as a handicap has become my greatest advantage. Scattered throughout the journal are oblique references to what occurred in New York, though never a direct account. In an entry from Christmas Day 1911, she writes, "6 years since that holiday season in New York. The lessons remain vivid, trust misplaced, virtue rewarded with humiliation. A woman alone viewed as either prey or pitiable. Father never understood until I showed him the evidence, and even then, his first instinct was to protect the family name rather than seek justice. Some battles cannot be won, he told me. Some enemies cannot be defeated in direct confrontation." He was right about that much, but he never imagined how thoroughly I would internalize that lesson, that if the battlefield is rigged against you, the only winning move is to abandon it entirely and create your own territory where different rules apply. What precisely this evidence entailed and who the enemies were remains unspecified. The most concrete clue appears in an entry from 1938, when Hazel records her reaction to a newspaper article. The financial pages report the death of Harrison Caldwell at age 73, respected investment banker and philanthropist, or they call him, devoted family man. Not a word about his other activities or the young women whose futures he destroyed with impunity. His position protected him in life, and now his reputation remains intact in death. Father was wrong about one thing. Time does not inevitably bring justice, but it has brought me something perhaps more valuable: indifference. I feel nothing upon reading of his passing. No anger, no vindication, no closure, only a clinical observation, another variable removed from the equation. Harrison Caldwell's identity and his connection to Hazel remain subjects of speculation. Research by the Shannon County Historical Society in the 1960s found that a Harrison Caldwell did indeed serve on the board of the Metropolitan Trust Company in New York during the period when Hazel studied there. No direct connection between them has been established in surviving records, though census data confirms that Caldwell maintained a residence on East 71st Street, not far from the women's housing where Hazel lived during her studies. The journal grows increasingly philosophical in its later years. As Hazel's health declined, she reflected more deeply on her unusual life choices. An entry from 1940 reads, "The world beyond my windows has transformed itself repeatedly during my vigil. Wars have begun and ended. Machines now dominate spaces once reserved for horses. Radio brings voices from thousands of miles away directly into homes. Yet, human nature remains stubbornly consistent. The same dramas play out in different costumes, the same mistakes repeated with new justifications. I do not regret my withdrawal. I have lived more fully within these walls than many who wander freely through the world without purpose or clarity. I have built a fortune greater than Father ever dreamed possible. I have read more books than most university professors. I have tracked the course of history through my newspapers and correspondence. And I have done it all without compromise, without submission, without pretending to be other than what I am. The price was high, yes. No husband, no children, no friends in the conventional sense. But what I purchased with that payment was infinitely precious. Sovereignty over myself, complete and uncontested. Few women of my generation can claim as much. As news of Hazel Thornfield's death and the discovery of her journal spread, the story attracted attention beyond the Ozarks. Newspapers in St. Louis and Kansas City ran features on the recluse of Thornfield Manor. A reporter from the Chicago Tribune traveled to Eminence in 1943 to research an article titled "The Woman Who Locked Herself Away." But the national obsession with World War II soon overshadowed the story, and Hazel's extraordinary life faded from public consciousness. In accordance with her final instructions, Thornfield Manor and its contents were transferred to the Shannon County Historical Society. The journal and selected artifacts were preserved, but the house itself, deemed structurally unsound after decades of neglect, was demolished in 1947. Only the family cemetery remains, where Hazel was buried beside her father in an unmarked grave at her own request. The financial assets she accumulated during her decades of seclusion proved substantial. Morris Fleming's records indicate that upon liquidation, Hazel Thornfield's estate was valued at approximately $2.3 million, an enormous sum for the time, equivalent to over $40 million today. As per her instructions, the bulk of this fortune was divided among educational institutions, with the stipulation that the funds be used to establish scholarships for young women of independent mind and circumstance. One of the beneficiaries was a small women's college in Massachusetts, which received funds to establish a department of economics, at the time an unusual field of study for women. The bequest letter, written by Hazel shortly before her death, stated, "Economic independence is the foundation of all other forms of freedom. May the young women who study here learn not only the mechanics of markets, but the value of controlling their own financial destiny." Perhaps the most enigmatic aspect of the Thornfield case remains the true nature of Hazel's experiences in New York prior to her father's death, the events that both she and Augustus alluded to as formative. Whatever transpired during that period has been lost to history. The destruction of records in the 1923 courthouse fire, combined with the passage of time, has erased whatever paper trail might have existed. What survives is the story of a woman who, when faced with conditions she found intolerable, created an alternative that suited her purposes. A woman who, through the simple act of locking a door, transformed confinement into autonomy. A woman who watched the world change from the window of an Ozark attic, participating in it precisely to the extent she chose, no more, no less. Intriguingly, during the inventory of Hazel's possessions, county officials discovered a small safe hidden beneath a floorboard near her writing desk. The combination was found in a sealed envelope in her journal, but when opened, the safe contained only a single item, a silver key that matched no lock in the manor. Attached to it was a handwritten note. Not all doors should be opened. Some remain better locked forever. The key's purpose was never determined. Some speculated it might open a deposit box in a St. Louis or New York bank, possibly containing the mysterious evidence mentioned in Hazel's journal. Others suggested it might be purely symbolic, a reminder of her voluntary confinement and the control she maintained over access to both her physical space and her inner life. The key remains in the collection of the Shannon County Historical Society, its purpose still unknown. In 1968, during renovations to the Shannon County Courthouse, workers discovered a sealed envelope in a wall cavity. Inside was a single sheet of paper bearing what appeared to be Hazel Thornfield's handwriting. The contents were brief. "To whoever finds this, I chose the attic. I would choose it again. Some prisons have walls of stone, others have walls of expectation. I built my own cell and held the only key. That is all the freedom anyone can truly hope for." H.T. 1905. The document was donated to the Historical Society, where it remains alongside Hazel's journal and the few photographs that survive of Thornfield Manor. Visitors occasionally ask to see these artifacts, though fewer each year as the story recedes further into local legend. In 1952, a doctoral student in psychology from Washington University in St. Louis attempted to analyze Hazel's case for his dissertation on extreme reclusion. His conclusions, while necessarily speculative, suggested that Hazel Thornfield might have suffered from what modern psychiatry would classify as social anxiety disorder, possibly triggered or exacerbated by traumatic experiences during her time in New York. However, he noted that her continued intellectual engagement, financial acumen, and structured daily life argue against complete psychological dysfunction. Miss Thornfield's isolation, he wrote, appears less a symptom of mental illness than a rational, if extreme, response to experiences and social conditions she found intolerable. The dissertation received little attention outside academic circles and has largely been forgotten. Yet it raises interesting questions about the line between pathology and rational choice, especially for women of Hazel's era, who faced severely limited options for independence. Perhaps the final word on Hazel Thornfield should come from her own journal. The last entry, dated 3 days before her death, reads, "The chest pain returned with greater intensity this morning. I find myself short of breath after even the smallest exertion. The end approaches, I think. I am not afraid." Looking back on the path that led me here, I see now that what began as escape became purpose. What seemed like retreat became advance in a different direction. I have lived exactly as I chose, answerable to no one. My decisions, for better or worse, were entirely my own. You can say as much. The key turns both ways. It locks the world out as surely as it locks me in. That distinction has made all the difference. And yet something of Hazel's presence seems to linger in the Ozark Hills. Hikers in the vicinity of where Thornfield Manor once stood sometimes report a sense of being watched. Locals speak of lights seen moving through the trees near the old property on certain nights. A woman's silhouette glimpsed at sunset against the sky. These are just stories, of course, the imaginings of a region that has always prized its mysteries and its isolation. But perhaps they contain a kernel of truth, that some choices echo beyond a lifetime, that some doors, once locked, leave their mark on both sides of the threshold. In the end, Hazel of the Ozarks remains what she chose to be, an enigma partially revealed, a life deliberately hidden, a woman who looked at the world's expectations and said simply and finally, no. The attic key was never found.